I still remember the sound my son's voice made when he said it. Cold. Sharp. Like I was some stranger embarrassing him in public. Take those ridiculous medals off before people see you. He said it 5 feet away from a wall covered in white roses that probably cost more than my first car. I looked down at the medals on my old Marine dress suit and honestly thought he was joking at first. Then he leaned closer and whispered, "Dad, I mean it. You look pathetic." My own son said that to me less than an hour before his wedding started. I didn't even know what to say. I just stood there holding the invitation he'd mailed me 3 months earlier like it still meant something. Around us, people in black tuxedos and silk dresses pretended not to stare. But they were staring. One woman actually smirked into her champagne glass. Another guy muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath like I was ruining the whole evening just by standing there. I wish I could tell you that was the worst part of that night. It wasn't. Not even close. Before I continue, if this story truly resonates with you, maybe take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening from somewhere out there tonight, leave your city, your country, and your local time in the comments. I always read them before bed. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 74 years old, and the night my son got married was the same night my family stopped feeling like a family. But to explain how it got that bad, I need to go back a few weeks before the wedding, back to the moment I realized my son Ethan was already ashamed of me long before I ever walked into that vineyard. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the porch outside my trailer in Flagstaff, Arizona, watching a thunderstorm roll over the mountains. My old yellow lab, Duke, was asleep beside my boots. The phone rang around 7:15. Ethan's name popped up on the screen. Now, Ethan didn't call often anymore. Mostly texts. Mostly short ones. Busy this week. Can't talk. Maybe next month. So when I saw his name, I actually smiled. "Hey kid," I answered. There was a pause. Then I heard traffic in the background and somebody laughing near him. "Hey Dad," he said quickly. "Listen, I only got a minute." Something about his tone already felt off. Fast. Distracted. Like talking to me was another business call he needed to finish before dinner. "Everything all right?" I asked. Yeah, fine. Listen, Vanessa's family is very high profile, okay?" I frowned a little. "All right. There are going to be investors at the wedding. Politicians too. A lot of important people." I laughed softly. "Sounds expensive." He didn't laugh back. "Dad, just don't make this weird." I remember going quiet after that. Thunder rolled somewhere far behind the mountains. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. Another pause. Then he sighed like I was already exhausting him. "Just no stories about the Marines. No political stuff. No old combat stories. And maybe wear a regular suit this time." I looked through the screen door into my living room. The old wooden medal box was sitting on the shelf beside my wife Helen's photo. "You mean don't wear my medals?" I said quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. That hurt worse than if he'd just said yes. "Dad," he finally muttered, "people don't really do that anymore." I stared out into the storm while my dog lifted his head and looked at me. "Those medals buried friends before they ever reached my chest," I told him. "I know," he snapped suddenly. "I know, all right. But this wedding isn't about you." Then silence. Just rain hitting the porch roof. A few seconds later, he softened his voice again, almost like damage control. "Look, I just want everything perfect for one night." Perfect. That word stayed with me after the call ended. Because the truth was, Ethan had spent the last 15 years building a perfect new life. The expensive house in San Francisco. The CEO title. The interviews in Forbes magazine. The country club memberships. The rich friends. The polished smile. And somewhere along the way, I think he decided there was no room in that perfect life for the old Marine father who still drove a 15-year-old Ford pickup and lived alone in a trailer with a bad knee and a folded American flag above the fireplace. What I didn't know back then, what nobody at that wedding knew, was that one of those medals in that wooden box didn't actually belong to me. That medal belonged to a man named Tommy Reed. Most people at the wedding would have looked at it and seen old metal pinned to faded fabric. But every time I touched it, I remembered the smell of smoke, wet sand, and diesel fuel from a place most Americans stopped thinking about years ago. Tommy was 22 when I met him. Loud laugh. Crooked nose from high school football. He used to carry instant coffee packets in his cargo pockets because he hated Army coffee. Said it tasted like burnt motor oil. We were stationed together overseas for almost 11 months. By the end of it, He felt more like a brother than half the people I shared blood with. Ethan was only 6 back then. Skinny little kid with freckles and missing front teeth. Every Sunday, if I could, I called home from base. The connection sounded terrible most days. Sometimes I could barely hear him. But Helen always put him on the phone anyway. "Daddy," he would yell. "Did you fight bad guys today?" I used to laugh every single time. "Not today, buddy." "Did you shoot tanks?" "No tanks either." "Mom says you are a hero." I remember sitting against a concrete wall in 115-degree heat, smiling like an idiot, while other Marines smoked cigarettes nearby. "Your mom exaggerates," I told him once. But Helen took the phone from him and said quietly, "No, I do not." Back then, my son looked at me like I hung the moon. That is the part people never tell you about becoming a parent. One day your child thinks you are the strongest man alive. Then life slowly teaches them to measure strength differently. Money, status, connections, expensive suits, big houses. Somewhere along the line, Ethan stopped seeing the man and started seeing what the man could not give him. After I came home from overseas, things were good for a while. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house outside Phoenix with cracked kitchen tiles and an air conditioner that barely worked during July. I worked construction during the day and security jobs at night because Ethan wanted to go to private school after his middle school got rough. I still remember the tuition brochure sitting on our kitchen table beside overdue electric bills. Helen looked at me and whispered, "We cannot afford this." But Ethan had overheard kids at school making fun of our old truck in our neighborhood. One night, he came home angry and threw his backpack onto the floor. "I hate this place," he snapped. Helen looked shocked. "Ethan, everybody else has normal parents with money." I remember the silence after that. The refrigerator humming. A dog barking somewhere outside. Ethan instantly looked guilty, but the words were already out there hanging in the room. I should have realized then how deeply shame had started planting itself inside him. Instead, I blamed myself. I picked up extra shifts, missed birthdays, missed anniversaries, missed sleep. I once worked 36 straight hours pouring concrete because Ethan needed money for a school trip to Washington, D.C. When I got home, Helen touched my face and said, "Walter, you are killing yourself." I told her it was temporary. I told her Ethan would appreciate it someday. The strange thing is, I think he did appreciate it once. I found proof of that years later completely by accident. About 6 months after Helen died from cancer, I was cleaning boxes in the garage when I found one labeled Ethan College Stuff. Inside were old notebooks, baseball photos, and a folded essay from his senior year of high school. The title said, "My Hero." It was about me. About the deployments, the long nights, the sacrifices. He wrote, "My father taught me that real men protect people even when nobody notices." I sat on the garage floor holding that paper for almost an hour. Because by then, Ethan already barely called me anymore. And the man who wrote those words about his father did not sound anything like the man who called me embarrassing years later. Things really started changing after Ethan moved to California. At first, I was proud of him every single day. He was smart, smarter than I ever was. He built some software company with 2 college friends out of a tiny apartment in San Jose. I did not understand half of what they actually sold, but investors started throwing money at them anyway. One article called him the next generation of American tech leadership. Helen taped that article to our refrigerator like it was a family trophy. I still remember her standing there smiling at it with a cup of coffee in her hand. "Look at our boy," she whispered. Back then, Ethan still called every Sunday. Sometimes he would even ask me advice about employees or pressure or leadership. "Dad, how did you keep guys calm when everybody was stressed?" he asked once. I laughed. Half the time I just made coffee and listened. He laughed too. "Seriously, I am serious." Those conversations used to mean everything to me. Then the money got bigger. The interviews got bigger. The houses got bigger. And somehow the distance between us got bigger too. The first time I visited his new place in San Francisco, I knew things were different the second I stepped inside. The house looked like a museum. White marble floors. Giant glass walls. Furniture nobody actually sat on. Everything smelled like expensive candles. I stood near the kitchen island holding a 6-pack of beer I brought from Arizona while Ethan rushed around talking into a wireless headset. "Yeah, move the Tokyo call to Thursday," he snapped before muting himself and glancing at me. "Dad, could you maybe not leave the cooler there?" I looked down. "Oh, Sure. He smiled quickly, but it did not reach his eyes. Thanks. That night, he invited coworkers over for dinner. Young guys in $1,000 jackets. Women talking about venture capital and private schools like everybody in America grew up with a trust fund. One man shook my hand and asked, "So what do you do, Walter?" Before I could answer, Ethan cut in from across the room. "My dad is retired." Just like that. Retired. Not Marine. Not construction foreman. Not the man who worked himself half to death keeping food on the table. Just retired. I remember staring down at my plate after that. Little things kept happening during that trip. Tiny cuts. Tiny embarrassments. But enough of them start adding up after a while. At breakfast the next morning, I found my old pickup truck keys sitting beside the coffee machine. Ethan picked them up with 2 fingers and said, "Dad, maybe park farther down the street while you are here." I frowned. "Why?" He gave a nervous little laugh. "The neighbors complain about older vehicles sitting out front." I looked out through the giant window at rows of luxury cars shining in the morning sun. Then I looked back at my son. "You serious?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "It is just how things work here." That sentence bothered me more than he probably realized. Because what he was really saying was this: people like me did not fit into people like him anymore. A few months later, Helen got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. Brutal. The kind that changes a family in one phone call. Ethan flew home immediately after I told him. I will always give him credit for that. He sat beside his mother at the hospital almost every night that first week. Held her hand. Brought flowers. Talked softly to nurses. For a little while, I thought maybe we had found our way back to each other. Then one evening, after Helen fell asleep, Ethan stepped into the hallway with me near the vending machines. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. "Dad," he said quietly, "if things get worse, maybe sell the trailer and move closer to me." I looked at him in surprise. "You mean that?" "Yeah. You actually want me around?" He looked uncomfortable after I said it. "Of course I do." But he said it too fast. Like it was the answer he knew he was supposed to give. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the screen immediately, and I saw it happen right there in front of me. The expression on his face changed the second the business world called him back. Helen died on a cold Thursday morning in November. Quietly. No dramatic final speech. No movie moment. Just one long breath, and then nothing after it. Ethan stood beside me in that hospital room, staring at the floor while machines beeped softly around us. I remember reaching for his shoulder, but he stepped away almost immediately and covered his face with both hands. For the first time in years, he looked like my little boy again. Lost. Scared. Human. The funeral happened 3 days later back in Flagstaff. Small service. Mostly neighbors, old church friends, and a few Marines I had not seen in years. Ethan arrived wearing a black designer coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Vanessa came with him. That was the first time I met her properly. Blonde hair. Perfect smile. The kind of woman who always looked like she knew where cameras were even when there were no cameras around. She hugged me lightly outside the church and said, "Helen sounded wonderful." Sounded wonderful. That was wonderful. Sounded wonderful. Even then, something about her felt rehearsed. During the reception after the funeral, I overheard Vanessa talking quietly to one of Ethan's friends near the coffee table. "He cannot stay in Arizona forever," she whispered. "Ethan already worries about him too much." I stood behind the hallway corner listening without meaning to. "What do you mean?" the friend asked. Vanessa lowered her voice even more. "Walter is struggling financially. Ethan does not tell people because he feels guilty." I felt my stomach tighten instantly. Struggling financially? I own my trailer outright. My truck was old, sure, but paid off. I lived simple because I wanted simple, not because I needed rescuing. Then Vanessa added something that hit even harder. "Honestly, Ethan has been supporting him for years." I actually laughed under my breath when I heard that because it was so absurd. Ethan had not paid a single bill for me in his life. Not one. But when I stepped around the corner, Vanessa's face changed immediately. "Walter," she said sweetly, "I was just saying how strong you have been through all this." I looked directly at her. "You seem confused about my finances." Her smile froze just for a second. Tiny little crack in the mask. "Oh," she laughed softly. "I only meant Ethan worries about you." "That is not what you said." Ethan walked upright, then carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Everything okay?" Vanessa touched his arm before I could answer. "Your father misunderstood me." Ethan looked tired already. irritated. Like conflict itself embarrassed him. Dad, he muttered quietly, can we not do this today? That sentence sat in my chest for days. Afterward, not can we talk? Not what happened. Just can we not do this? Like the truth itself was inconvenient. A week later, I got my first real glimpse into how bad things had become. Ethan invited me to dinner at his house in San Francisco before flying back overseas for a conference. Halfway through the meal, one of Vanessa's friends asked me, "So, Walter, how long have you been retired now?" "About 9 years," I answered. She smiled politely. "That must be nice having Ethan take care of everything." I looked at Ethan immediately. He would not look back at me. He just kept cutting his steak. "Excuse me?" I asked slowly. The woman blinked. "Vanessa said Ethan helps support you since the military pension is not enough." I felt heat rise into my face. "That is not true." The whole table went quiet. Vanessa took a sip of wine and gave me that same calm smile again. "Nobody is judging you, Walter." That was the moment I realized this was not random gossip anymore. This was a story, a carefully polished version of me they had been handing out to people behind my back. The aging father, the struggling veteran, the burdened successful Ethan nobly carried out of duty. And the worst part was, people believed it because Ethan never corrected them. I drove back to Arizona the next morning with both hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. Around midnight, my phone buzzed at a gas station outside Kingman. It was Ethan. I almost ignored it. "Dad," he said immediately after I answered. Vanessa did not mean anything by it. I stared out at the empty highway under the station lights. Then why did she say it? Silence. Then he sighed heavily. "Look, some people just would not understand your lifestyle." My lifestyle, like living modestly after burying friends and losing my wife, was some kind of social problem to manage. I remember whispering, "You let them think I am pathetic." And Ethan answered with 5 words that shattered something inside me. "Dad, you are overreacting again." After that phone call, things between me and Ethan changed fast. Not loud at first. Quiet. Polite. That was somehow worse. We stopped talking like father and son and started talking like two people trying not to argue at work. Every conversation felt careful, measured, like he was constantly checking the exits in case emotions showed up. I tried fixing it. God knows I tried. 3 days after the gas station call, I wrote him an email around 2 in the morning because I could not sleep. I still remember every word of the subject line. "I do not want us to become strangers." I told him I was not angry about the money comments. Not really. I told him what hurt was hearing people describe me like some burden he carried out of pity. I wrote, "I spent my whole life trying to make sure you never felt ashamed of where you came from." Then I stared at my inbox for 2 straight days waiting for a reply. Nothing came. On the 3rd day, I got a text instead. "Busy week. We'll call later." He never did. A month passed. Then another. Birthdays became text messages. Holidays became excuses. "Sorry, Dad, traveling." "Sorry, Dad, investor dinner." "Sorry, Dad, bad timing." One night I called him after hearing on the news that his company had signed some massive deal overseas. I was genuinely proud of him. The receptionist transferred me 3 different times before I finally heard his voice. "Dad?" he whispered immediately. "I am in a meeting. I just wanted to say congratulations." Silence for half a second. Then softer this time. "Thanks." I smiled a little standing alone in my kitchen. "Your mother would have been proud of you." Another silence. Longer now. Then I heard somebody near him ask, "Who is that?" Ethan answered before he muted the phone completely. "Just my dad. Just my dad." I stood there listening to muffled voices through the speaker for almost 30 seconds before the line disconnected. I do not even think he realized he hung up on me. Around Christmas that year, I mailed him something important. Tommy Reed's photograph. The only copy I still had. It showed Tommy and me sitting on an armored vehicle overseas covered in dust and laughing about something I cannot even remember anymore. On the back, I wrote, "One day I will tell you why I carry his medal." Ethan texted me 4 days later. "Package arrived. Thanks." That was it. No question. No curiosity. Nothing. I sat there staring at those 3 words until my coffee went cold. It was strange realizing your own child no longer wanted to know who you really were. The final thing I tried was a letter. An actual handwritten letter like my father used to write me. 6 pages. I wrote about Helen. About the early years. About baseball games and school pickups, and all the nights I worked construction with swollen knees because he needed tuition money. I even apologized for things I probably should not have apologized for. Missing birthdays. Being strict sometimes. Not always understanding him. At the very end, I wrote, I do not care about your money or your status. I only care about whether there is still room for me in your life. 2 weeks later, the envelope came back in my mailbox unopened. Wrong forwarding address stamped across the front in red ink. But I had mailed it to the correct address. I checked 3 times. I remember sitting in my truck outside the post office holding that unopened letter while people walked past me carrying Christmas shopping bags. For a long time, I just stared at Ethan's name written in my own handwriting. Then I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the glove compartment. After that, I stopped trying for a while. The silence between us became normal. Morning coffee alone, dinner alone, birthdays alone. Sometimes days passed without hearing another human voice except the cashier at the grocery store asking paper or plastic. And the worst part was not even the loneliness. It was the feeling that somewhere out there, my own son had slowly replaced me with a version of me that was easier to explain to rich people. The winter, after all, that was the quietest season of my life. Arizona gets cold in ways people do not expect. Dry cold. The kind that slips under doors at night and settles into your bones. Most mornings I woke up before sunrise because my knee hurt too much to sleep longer than 4 or 5 hours. I would make coffee in the dark and sit at the tiny kitchen table staring at Helen's chair across from me. I never moved it after she died. Her reading glasses still sat beside a stack of crossword books near the window. Sometimes I caught myself almost speaking to her before remembering the house did not answer anymore. Duke got older too, faster than I was ready for. His hips started giving out around February. One morning, he could not make it up the trailer steps without help. I remember kneeling beside him in the cold while he looked embarrassed, like dogs somehow know when their bodies stop cooperating. Easy, old man, I whispered. We are both falling apart. He wagged his tail anyway. Ethan did not call on Christmas that year. He texted at 11:48 that night. Merry Christmas, Dad. Sorry today got crazy. I stared at the message for a long time before putting the phone face down on the table. The strange thing about loneliness is how physical it becomes after enough time passes. You feel it in rooms, in silence, in the way nobody says your name out loud anymore. One afternoon in March, I slipped while unloading groceries outside the trailer. Nothing dramatic, just my bad knee giving out on wet gravel. I landed hard enough to bruise my ribs. I sat there in the driveway breathing through the pain while a bag of oranges rolled across the dirt. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized something terrifying. If I died right there, nobody would know for days. That thought stayed with me. A few weeks later, Duke stopped eating. The vet in town was honest with me. Walter, she said gently, he is tired. I nodded because I already knew. I sat on the floor beside him that last night with an old blanket over both of us. His breathing sounded shallow, slow. I scratched behind his ears and whispered stories to him about Ethan as a little boy. Remember when he used to sneak you hot dogs under the table? Duke lifted his tail once against the floor. Barely. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself crying harder over that old dog than I had cried in months. Maybe because he had been the only living thing left in that trailer that still looked happy every time I walked through the door. After he was gone, the silence became unbearable. No nails clicking on the floor. No barking at delivery trucks. Nothing. I started leaving the television on, just to hear voices in the background. One night, I caught myself sitting in the dark rereading Ethan's old essay again. My hero. The paper had started yellowing around the edges. I traced my thumb over one sentence he wrote when he was 17 years old. My father never lets people face hard things alone. I remember laughing softly at that because by then I had become an expert at facing hard things alone. Around early spring, I got a call from a man named Richard Cole. At first I did not recognize the name. His voice sounded older, rougher. Walter Hayes, he asked. Yeah, you probably do not remember me. Then he said something that made me sit upright instantly. Fallujah, South Checkpoint, 2004. I went completely still. Some memories never really leave your body. Richard, I whispered. He laughed once, still breathing somehow. We talked for nearly 2 hours that night. About old Marines. About funerals. About getting old. About all the stupid things young men survive before arthritis finishes the job. Before hanging up, he said quietly, Heard about your wife. I am sorry, brother. I closed my eyes after that word. Brother. I had not heard someone say it to me like they truly meant it in a very long time. Then Richard asked me something unexpected. You ever come out to California these days? I looked around the empty trailer, at the cold coffee sitting untouched beside Helen's chair, and answered honestly. Not much anymore. Maybe that needs to change, he said. Richard started calling every Thursday after that. Sometimes we talked 10 minutes. Sometimes 2 hours. He lived outside San Diego in a small house near the water with a garage full of fishing gear and old Navy photographs. The first time he invited me out there, I almost said no automatically. By then I had gotten used to shrinking my life down to routines. Coffee, grocery store, quiet television, sleep, repeat. But Richard kept pushing gently. Come out for a few days, he said. You look worse every time I hear your voice. I laughed at that. You cannot see me. Do not need to. So that summer, for the first time in nearly 3 years, I drove west instead of staying home. The trip took almost 9 hours with my knee stopping me every couple of gas stations. When I finally pulled into Richard's driveway, he stepped outside wearing sandals, an old Navy sweatshirt, and sunglasses. Bigger than I remembered. Older too. But his handshake still felt like gripping a wrench. Damn, he said looking at me carefully. You got skinny. Good to see you too. He laughed and pulled me into a hug before I could complain. Something about that moment loosened a knot inside my chest I did not even realize I had been carrying. Richard did not treat me like a burden. He did not speak carefully around me like I was fragile. He just acted like I still belonged somewhere. The next morning, he dragged me down to the marina at 6:30 in the morning. You fish? He asked. Badly. Perfect. We spent hours sitting on folding chairs beside the water, drinking burnt coffee from a thermos and arguing about baseball. Nobody cared what car I drove. Nobody asked about money. Nobody looked embarrassed standing beside me. One afternoon, Richard introduced me to a group of older veterans who met every Wednesday at a small diner near Oceanside. Marines, Navy, Army, one Air Force guy everybody made fun of constantly. The waitress knew all their names. You are Walter? She asked, smiling. Richard has been talking about you for weeks. Richard pointed at me with his fork. This idiot once carried me half a mile after an explosion. I shook my head immediately. That is not how it happened. That is exactly how it happened. The others leaned in listening while Richard told the story anyway. I noticed something strange while he talked. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody looked uncomfortable hearing about my past. For the first time in years, I did not feel like some outdated piece of furniture people politely tolerated. I felt visible again. After that trip, things slowly started changing. I began getting out of the house more. Fixed up the trailer. Started walking every morning before sunrise despite the knee pain. One of the veterans helped me volunteer twice a week at a community center teaching basic woodworking to teenagers. The first day, some 16-year-old kid stared at my old Marine cap and asked, You really served? Long time ago, I answered. He looked impressed anyway. That is cool as hell. I almost laughed hearing that. Nobody had called anything about me cool in a very long time. Around October, Richard convinced me to attend a military fundraiser in San Diego. I nearly refused when he told me it was formal. I do not have anything nice enough anymore. Richard rolled his eyes. Walter, half the people there are 70 years old and held together by prescription medication. Nobody cares. Before the event, I opened the old wooden metal box for the first time in months. The ribbons looked dull under the kitchen light. I sat there quietly touching Tommy's metal between my fingers. Richard noticed immediately. Still carrying him with you? I nodded once. He grew serious for a second. Good. That night at the fundraiser, several younger Marines came up shaking my hand after Richard introduced me. One man even recognized Tommy Reed's name. Wait, he said softly. You knew Sergeant Reed? I looked at him in surprise. Yeah. The Marine smiled slowly. They still talk about him at Pendleton. I did not know what to say after that. I just stood there holding a paper cup of coffee while something warm and unfamiliar settled into my chest. Pride maybe, or dignity returning little by little. Later that evening, while Richard and I sat outside overlooking the ocean, my phone suddenly buzzed. Ethan's name appeared on the screen for the first time in almost 4 months. I almost did not answer Ethan's call that night. Richard looked over from his chair near the ocean and raised an eyebrow when he saw my face change. Everything all right? He asked. I stared at the phone vibrating in my hand. It is my son. Richard leaned back slowly. That complicated, huh? I gave a small laugh. You have no idea. Then I answered, "Hey." Ethan sounded different immediately. Lighter somehow. "Dad, where are you?" I looked out at the black water moving below the cliffs. "California." "Seriously?" "Yeah." "Doing what?" Before I could answer, Richard yelled loudly from behind me. "Tell him you finally found cooler friends." Ethan actually laughed hearing that. Real laugh too. Not the fake business version. Something in my chest loosened hearing it. "I am with an old friend," I told him. "Marine." "Navy." Richard shouted again. "Better looking branch too." Ethan laughed a second time. I had not heard that sound from him in years. Then his tone shifted slightly. "More careful now. Listen, I wanted to tell you something." I leaned against the railing. "Okay. Vanessa and I are getting married." I closed my eyes for a second and smiled despite everything between us. "Well, damn," I whispered. "Congratulations, kid." "Thanks." There was a pause before he added, "Wedding is in Napa next spring." I could hear people talking around him in the background. Music too. Some expensive restaurant probably. Then he said something I did not expect. "I want you there." Not need. Not should. Want. Those words mattered to me more than he probably realized. After the call ended, Richard studied my face carefully. "You all right?" I nodded slowly. "I think maybe my son remembered I exist." Richard snorted. "Families are messy. Does not mean they are dead." Over the next few months, life kept moving in ways I did not expect. The veterans group asked if I would help organize community events because apparently I was good with people, which still makes me laugh. Suddenly I had schedules, meetings, places to be. One retired colonel even talked me into speaking at a local high school on Veterans Day. I stood at that podium wearing a clean dark suit with my Marine Corps pin on the lapel, while teenagers sat staring at their phones pretending not to care. But halfway through the speech, one kid raised his hand and asked quietly, "How do you keep going after losing people?" The room got silent after that. I looked down at the podium for a second before answering honestly. Sometimes you do not keep going because you are strong. Sometimes you keep going because the people you lost would be furious if you quit. Afterward, the principal shook my hand near the gym doors. "You should do more speaking," she said. "People listen to you." It felt strange hearing that after years of feeling invisible. Around that same time, Richard started dragging me to more veteran events and fundraisers. At one dinner in San Diego, they introduced me on stage as Staff Sergeant Walter Hayes, United States Marine Corps. The room stood and applauded while I walked awkwardly toward the microphone wishing they would stop making such a fuss. But I will admit something honestly. Seeing my name printed on that little gold table card beside the Marine Corps emblem did something to me. It reminded me I had a life before loneliness swallowed everything. I had history, identity, people who still remembered. One evening after an event, Richard tossed me a black polo shirt with an embroidered logo on the chest. Cole Foundation Veteran Outreach. "What is this?" I asked. "Uniform," he answered casually. "You are working with us now." I laughed. "You never asked me. You going to say no?" Truthfully, I did not want to. The work mattered. Helping older veterans with housing paperwork, medical appointments, support groups. Men who looked exhausted the same way I had been exhausted. One guy grabbed my hand outside a clinic one afternoon and whispered, "Thanks for treating me like a person." I sat in my truck afterward staring at the steering wheel because I realized nobody had spoken to me that sincerely in years. Slowly, piece by piece, I started becoming someone again outside of being Ethan's embarrassing old father. Then one rainy afternoon in January, a cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox with elegant gold lettering across the front. "Ethan and Vanessa Hayes request the honor of your presence." The wedding was held at a vineyard about an hour outside Napa. The kind of place with stone archways, white flowers everywhere, and employees who spoke so softly it almost sounded rehearsed. I arrived early because old Marines are either late or 1 hour early. There is no middle ground. My truck looked completely out of place beside the line of black luxury SUVs near the entrance. I noticed that immediately. So did the valet. He walked toward me slowly, glanced at my truck, then asked, "Delivery?" I almost laughed. "Wedding." His face changed fast after that. "Oh, sorry, sir." I grabbed my garment bag from the passenger seat and stepped out carefully because my knee had been acting up all morning. Inside the garment bag was my old dark Marine suit. Pressed clean, metals polished the night before at my kitchen table under a yellow lamp, including Tommy Reed's medal. I stood in the parking lot for a second, holding that bag tighter than I probably needed to. Then I walked toward the vineyard. Everything smelled expensive. Fresh flowers, wine, rain from the night before, still sitting on the grass. Staff members rushed around carrying trays and adjusting decorations, while a string quartet played softly somewhere near the ceremony area. At the front entrance, a young hostess smiled politely at me until her eyes dropped to my boots and old truck behind me. "Staff entrance is around the back," she said automatically. I blinked once. "I am Walter Hayes." She checked her clipboard quickly and her entire posture changed. "Oh my goodness. I am so sorry. Mr. Hayes, right this way." That happened 3 more times before noon. People assuming I worked there. Caterer. Security. Maintenance. One man in a navy suit actually handed me an empty champagne glass without even looking directly at me. "Another one," he muttered. I handed it back without saying anything. Around 1:30, I finally spotted Ethan near the reception tent speaking with 2 men in expensive gray suits. He looked polished. Perfect haircut. Tailored tuxedo. Gold watch flashing under the sunlight every time he moved his hand. For a second, I just stood there quietly watching him. Because despite everything between us, part of me still saw the freckled little boy asking if I fought bad guys overseas. Ethan noticed me a few seconds later. His smile froze almost instantly when his eyes landed on my medals. Even from 30 feet away, I saw it happen. He excused himself from the conversation and walked over quickly. "Dad," he said under his breath. "You wore them." I looked down at the medals. "Yeah." He rubbed his jaw tightly while glancing around to see who might be listening. "I thought we talked about this." "No," I answered calmly. "You talked." I listened. His eyes narrowed. Slightly at that. "Vanessa's family is here already." "Okay. And investors are showing up soon." I nodded slowly because I genuinely did not understand what point he was trying to make anymore. Ethan leaned closer. "Dad, people are going to stare." I looked around at the vineyard filled with giant flower displays, photographers, and a 7-piece jazz band setting up beside the dance floor. "Pretty sure there is already plenty to look at." He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Can you just try not to make tonight complicated?" Before I could answer, a woman's voice interrupted behind us. "Ethan, sweetheart, the mayor just arrived." Vanessa approached wearing a white silk robe while makeup artists followed behind her carrying brushes and garment bags. She stopped the second she saw my medals. Her smile flickered for half a heartbeat, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "Walter," she said politely. "You made it. Would not miss it." Her eyes lingered on Tommy's medal for just a second too long before she looked back at Ethan. "Can I steal you?" she asked him softly. Ethan nodded immediately, but before leaving, he looked at me one more time and said quietly enough that only I could hear it, "Please do not embarrass me today." Then they walked away together across the vineyard while guests kept arriving in waves. I stood there alone beside the entrance listening to laughter and clinking glasses all around me. And that was when I noticed someone across the outdoor bar staring directly at my medals. An older man, broad shoulders, white hair, still posture. He lifted his bourbon slightly toward me like recognition had just hit him. Then he started walking in my direction. The man walking toward me moved with the kind of posture you only see in people who spent years carrying weight on their backs. Straight spine, calm eyes, no wasted movement. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie and held a bourbon glass low near his waist. When he got close enough, he looked directly at Tommy Reed's medal and went completely still. "No damn way," he whispered. I studied his face for a second before recognition hit me too. "Richard." He laughed softly and grabbed my shoulder. "You stubborn old Marine." We stood there smiling like idiots for a moment while people in designer clothes drifted around us, carrying champagne. Then Richard pointed toward Tommy's medal. "You still carry it. Every important day." Richard nodded once without looking away from it. "Good." A younger man standing nearby overheard us and stepped closer. "Wait," he asked Richard carefully. "You know each other?" Richard gave him a strange look. "Know each other?" He pointed at me with his glass. "This man dragged me out of a burning convoy outside Fallujah." The younger man blinked. "Seriously?" I immediately shook my head. "Richard exaggerates." "No," Richard answered calmly. "Actually, I usually leave out the worst part, because most people stop sleeping afterward." A few guests nearby had started quietly listening now. Not in a dramatic way, just curiosity spreading naturally through the crowd. One older businessman stepped closer and asked, You served together? Richard looked almost offended by the question. Walter Hayes saved 3 lives that day. I shifted uncomfortably. Richard. What? He said. It is true. Then he turned toward the small group gathering around us. Most men freeze under pressure. Walter never did. I could already feel tension building somewhere behind me before I even turned around. Ethan was approaching fast. Smile gone. Jaw tight. Vanessa beside him looking equally uncomfortable. Richard, Ethan said carefully. I did not realize you knew my father. Richard stared at him for a long second before answering. Known him a hell of a lot longer than I have known you. Ethan forced a small laugh that fooled absolutely nobody standing there. Small world. Richard took a sip from his bourbon. Not really. Men like your father tend to leave permanent impressions. The silence after that sentence felt strange. Heavy somehow. I noticed several guests now openly staring at my medals instead of pretending not to notice them anymore. One woman near the bar whispered something to her husband while looking directly at Tommy's medal. Ethan saw it too. I could tell. His entire body looked tense suddenly, like the situation was slipping. Somewhere outside his control. Vanessa stepped in quickly with her polished social smile. Walter never talks about his military experience. That is because he is not the type to advertise sacrifice, Richard answered before I could speak. Ethan folded his arms. Richard, I appreciate the stories, but tonight is really about the wedding. Richard looked at him calmly. Funny thing about sacrifice. Weddings tend to exist because somebody sacrificed first. Dead silence after that. Ethan's face hardened immediately. I could practically see the embarrassment burning through him now. Not because of me. Because attention had shifted away from his carefully managed perfect image. One of the investors standing nearby suddenly looked at me differently and asked, Mr. Hayes, were you awarded the Silver Star? I opened my mouth to answer, but Richard spoke first. He turned down interviews after it happened. The investor blinked hard. You turned down national press? Did not seem important, I answered honestly. The man stared at me like I had just spoken another language. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face briefly before forcing another smile toward the crowd. All right, everybody, let us not turn my father into the main event tonight. Nobody laughed. And that was the moment I finally understood something painful. Ethan was not ashamed because I had failed in life. He was ashamed because people were beginning to respect me in ways he could not control. Vanessa touched Ethan's arm gently and whispered, maybe we should move people toward dinner. But before they could walk away, Richard looked directly at Ethan and asked one quiet question that changed the entire atmosphere around us. Does your father know what you told your board about him? Ethan froze instantly. Completely froze. And for the first time all day, I saw real fear enter my son's face. The air around us changed immediately after Richard asked that question. People stopped pretending not to listen. You could feel it happening table by table across the reception area. Quiet conversations fading. Glasses lowering. Eyes turning toward Ethan. My son recovered fast at first. I will give him that. Years in corporate boardrooms had taught him how to smile through panic. Richard, he said lightly, this really is not the place for business discussions. Richard did not blink. Funny, you made it business first. Ethan's jaw tightened. Vanessa stepped closer beside him, her voice soft but sharp underneath. I think there has been some misunderstanding. Richard finally looked at her. No misunderstanding at all. Then he turned toward me slowly. Walter, about 8 months ago, Ethan's board started discussing public image issues before a defense contract presentation. I frowned slightly, confused. Ethan interrupted immediately. Richard. But Richard kept speaking calmly. One board member suggested featuring military family connections during the presentation because it helps with federal partnerships. I stared at Ethan now. He would not look directly at me anymore. Richard continued. That is when Ethan told them his father was unstable, financially dependent, and struggled with emotional issues connected to military service. Complete silence. Not dramatic silence. Worse, the kind where nobody even shifts in their seat anymore. I honestly thought I had heard him wrong at first. What? I asked quietly. Ethan rubbed both hands together hard. Dad, it was more complicated than that. Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. Not really. You made him sound like a liability. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. That was for legal and corporate protection. I looked at her slowly. Protection from what? She opened her mouth, then stopped. Ethan stepped in quickly. Dad, large companies evaluate risk differently. Risk, I repeated softly. That is what I became. Ethan lowered his voice immediately, trying to regain control. Please. Not here. But something inside me had already gone strangely calm. Maybe because after enough disappointment, anger burns itself out and leaves clarity behind. One of the older investors near the bar suddenly spoke up. Ethan, is any of this untrue? Ethan looked trapped for the first time in his life. I was trying to avoid complications, he muttered. Richard stared at him with open disbelief. Your father spent decades carrying responsibilities most men would run from, and you reduced him to a public relations problem. Ethan finally snapped a little then. You do not understand how the world works now. Richard answered immediately. No, I understand exactly how your world works. Nobody moved after that. Somewhere in the distance, the string quartet kept playing because they had no idea the wedding reception had quietly turned into something else entirely. I looked at Ethan standing there in his perfect tuxedo, surrounded by rich guests and polished speeches, and realized something painful. He truly believed what he had done was reasonable, strategic, necessary. That hurt more than if he had simply hated me. I reached up slowly and touched Tommy Reed's medal against my jacket. Then I looked directly at my son. You know what the strange part is? I asked quietly. Ethan swallowed hard, but said nothing. I spent years thinking I embarrassed you because I was not successful enough. I shook my head once. Turns out the problem was that I reminded you where you came from. Vanessa stepped forward carefully. Walter, nobody wanted to hurt you. I looked at her calmly. You told people my son was supporting me financially. She held my gaze for half a second before answering. It simplified things socially. Simplified things socially. I almost smiled hearing that because it perfectly explained everything wrong with the world they lived in. Richard muttered under his breath, Jesus Christ. Ethan finally looked directly at me again. His voice sounded smaller now. Dad, I was trying to protect the company. I nodded slowly. And who exactly protected me? He had no answer for that. None. Around us, guests started quietly drifting away from the conversation, uncomfortable now that the polished image had cracked open in public. One woman actually whispered, "Oh my God," while walking past with her champagne glass. I looked around at all of it for a second. The flowers, the expensive suits, the giant white wedding tent glowing under vineyard lights. Then I looked back at Ethan. I am not going to make a scene, I told him calmly. But after tonight, you do not get to rewrite me anymore. Ethan's face changed hearing that. Fear mixed with something else now. Regret maybe. Or the realization that respect once lost does not always come back. But even standing there watching him struggle for words, part of me still saw my little boy buried somewhere underneath all that polished ambition. And honestly, that made everything hurt even more. The wedding still happened that night. Quietly. Awkwardly. You could feel the difference afterward, though. Conversations became softer. Forced smiles cracked easier. People who had ignored me earlier suddenly looked me directly in the eyes when they passed. One older woman touched my arm near the coffee station and whispered, "Thank you for your service." I nodded politely, but the truth is, the words barely registered anymore. My mind stayed on Ethan. Around 10 that evening, I stepped away from the reception and walked out toward the vineyard rows behind the main building. The air smelled like wet soil and cold grapes. Music drifted softly from the tent behind me while tiny lights glowed along the pathway. I sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking the hills with Tommy's medal resting in my palm. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps crunching slowly on gravel. Ethan. He stopped several feet away before speaking. Dad. His voice sounded exhausted. Smaller somehow. I did not answer immediately. I just kept staring out at the dark vineyards stretching across the hills. Finally, he sat down beside me carefully, still wearing that expensive tuxedo that suddenly looked too tight around the shoulders. Richard should not have said all that publicly, he muttered. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. You are still worried about public damage? He lowered his eyes after that. Long silence. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear from him. I think I forgot who I was trying to become. The wind moved softly through the vines around us. Somewhere far off, people laughed near the reception tent, but it sounded distant now. Ethan rubbed his face slowly with both hands. Everything became image, he admitted quietly. Investors, boards, clients. Every room felt like people were measuring me all the time. He swallowed hard before continuing. And somewhere along the way, I started measuring you too. That one hurt. Maybe because it was honest. I looked down at Tommy's medal in my hand. You know why I wear this one? Ethan shook his head. Tommy Reed died covering 3 younger Marines during an ambush. 22 years old. Ethan stared quietly at the medal. He gave people time to survive. My voice stayed calm, but my throat tightened anyway. Every important moment in my life after that, I carried his medal because I promised myself I would never become the kind of man who forgets sacrifice once life gets comfortable. Ethan looked away immediately after hearing that. His eyes looked wet under the vineyard lights. Dad. No, I said gently. Let me finish. He went silent. You spent years trying to protect your image from people like me. I touched the medal softly between my fingers. But the older you get, son, the more you realize reputation means nothing if it costs you your soul. Ethan covered his mouth with one hand and stared at the ground for a long time. Finally, he whispered, I do not know how to fix this. And for the first time in years, he sounded like my child again instead of a CEO. I nodded slowly because the truth mattered more than comfort now. Some things do not go back to the way they were. He closed his eyes after hearing that. But, I added quietly, that does not mean they cannot become something honest. We sat there in silence after that. No dramatic reconciliation. No perfect ending. Real life rarely gives those. But when Ethan finally stood up to walk back toward the wedding, he stopped and looked at me one more time. I am sorry, he said. Not polished. Not rehearsed. Just tired and human. And strangely enough, that was enough for me to believe he meant it. A few months later, Ethan called more often. Not every day. Not perfect. But real. He started asking questions again. About Helen. About the Marines. About Tommy. One weekend, he even drove to Arizona and helped me repaint the trailer porch without posting a single photo online. That probably meant more to me than anything else. These days my life is quieter than it used to be, but it is honest. I still volunteer with veterans. I still drink terrible coffee with Richard every Thursday morning whenever I am in California. And Tommy's medal still rests in the same wooden box beside Helen's photograph every night before I go to bed. I think the biggest lesson I learned from all this is that love without respect eventually becomes grief. You can forgive people. You can leave the door unlocked for them. But you should never hand someone the power to define your worth for you. If somebody listening to this feels forgotten by their own family right now, hear me clearly when I say this. Your value does not disappear just because someone else stopped recognizing it. Sometimes people get so distracted chasing status, approval, or success that they lose sight of the hands that carried them there in the first place. Protect your peace. Protect your dignity. And trust that God, time, and truth have a way of revealing character eventually. My name is Walter Hayes. I am 74 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never shrink yourself just to make other people comfortable with your existence. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Truly, stories like this remind us that none of us are as alone as we think we are. And if this journey meant something to you, maybe leave a comment sharing where you are listening from, because somebody out there probably needs to hear they are not the only one carrying old wounds quietly. There are more stories waiting in this channel about family, betrayal, healing, and the moments that change people forever. Some endings are painful. Some are hopeful. But all of them come from real human struggles people rarely talk about out loud. And maybe the next story will feel a little too familiar too.